Good morning. I want to start by acknowledging the enormous amount of heartache and empathy Vermonters are feeling for families in Israel who are dealing with an enormous amount of pain and suffering following the heinous acts of terror committed against innocent civilians over the weekend. What we're seeing is barbaric, the senseless killing of women, babies, and the elderly by Hamas. We watch in horror, and the violence is unspeakable. I reached out to Rabbi Toby Weissman and asked her to share with our fellow Jewish faith leaders to give our support, unwavering support to them through what is an incredibly difficult time. Later today, I'll be participating in a briefing with the White House and the nation's governors to better understand what we're doing as a country, as well as what we can do as states to assist our allies. Next, we're going to update you on climate resiliency projects as we've continued to work on over the last several years, building on what we started after Tropical Storm Irene, and that clearly needs to be prioritized in the years ahead as we adapt to a changing climate. When it comes to responding to climate change, my team's philosophy has been to work on efforts to lower emissions while also preparing us for impacts of more powerful and severe storm events. To be clear, even if we were to fully eliminate greenhouse gas emissions in Vermont, the impacts of climate change will continue. So only focusing on emissions without also addressing resiliency isn't enough. We have to do both. Over the past several years, my administration has proposed and secured historic investments in these areas. As a reminder, when we received ARPA funding, I asked the legislature to appropriate about $250 million for EV infrastructure, weatherization, flood resiliency, and more. Unfortunately, we did face some opposition from those who didn't want us to focus on resiliency work, but I think this summer's flooding shows why it's so important. Because these severe weather events will continue. So as we recover and rebuild, we need to be thinking about adaptation as well as resiliency. And in some cases, we need to think big. And my team is doing just that in coordination with our federal delegation as we seek supplemental funding from Congress. Secretary Moore will go into more details, but now that we're a couple months out from the worst of the floods, I thought it was important to update Vermonters on the work we've done and what needs to be done ahead of us. So with that, I'll turn it over to Secretary Moore.
Good afternoon. In the context of our changing environment, one in which we're seeing more severe storms as evidenced this summer, but that can also be easy to forget extended periods of drought, much of the state of Vermont was actually in a moderate drought condition at the end of June of this year, which seems impossibly far behind us. Heat waves both earlier in the summer, thinking back to May, as well as later into the fall, and increased health risks from air pollution and disease. Vermont is continuing to take steps to better cope with and effectively recover from this wider range of environmental conditions, to be able to anticipate, prepare for, and respond to extremes. It is the essence of becoming more resilient. And there are both infrastructure and natural systems components of thinking about resilience in the face of climate change. Vermonters and Vermont communities need access to clean water, safe roads and bridges that are able to withstand high flows, and affordable, energy-efficient housing. Vermont's wildlife, both animals and plants, species and ecosystems, require connected habitats that support their ability to adapt and move across the landscape. That said, resilience is not synonymous with eliminating all risk, and it's important to keep in mind we can't simply snap our fingers and become resilient. It requires a long-term commitment and a workable plan. Obviously, the path of every storm, rainfall amounts, and what debris ends up where is different each time, so it can be difficult to make a direct comparison between events. But all indications are that the programs and projects undertaken to repair damage created by Tropical Storm Irene and improve resiliency performed very well this summer. In the coming years, it'll be imperative to continue to build on this work and implement the programs and projects both to build back better and make proactive investments that enhance resilience. To my mind, this work can be organized into 4 broad categories: investing in nature-based solutions, floodproofing and hardening existing infrastructure that needs to remain in vulnerable locations, designing and maintaining reliable infrastructure, not only in current conditions, but in light of future climate conditions, and being ready with fast, effective response and recovery. Provide a little bit more detail on each of these as well as some examples. I'll start with nature-based solutions, which is really focused on conservation and restoration of different areas of the landscape. Things like protecting and restoring wetlands and floodplains, giving rivers room to move and spill over their banks without causing catastrophic flooding, as well as conserving large woodland tracts to ensure forests remain forests, both to stoke away stormwater and protect biodiversity. A great example of this is Water Street River Park in Northfield. Flooding along the Dog River during Tropical Storm Irene damaged 18 homes in Northfield's Water Street neighborhood. The town worked with affected property owners and FEMA to secure flood buyouts that helped homeowners move out of harm's way and allowed the town to acquire about 5 acres of contiguous floodplain area right outside the downtown. That 5-acre area is now known as Water Street River Park and has walking paths used by community members as well as their dogs and access to the river for wading and fishing. The park has also reduced flood risk and enhanced the downtown. Floodproofing or hardening of infrastructure, on the other hand, are changes made to reduce or eliminate flood damage to buildings, including things like water and wastewater facilities. An example here is investments made in the Waterbury State Office Complex following Tropical Storm Irene. Specifically, all mechanical, electrical, and plumbing systems in the complex were moved from basement areas to higher floors, and the basement was then filled and structurally reinforced so that now the lowest floor elevation in those historic buildings is above the 500-year flood level. As a result, the Waterbury State Complex experienced only minimal damage during the July 2023 flooding and was fully open and operational within 2 weeks' time. Thinking about infrastructure further, we need to think about how we make design decisions with not only current but future climate conditions in mind, and keeping up with needed maintenance and improvements to existing infrastructure assets. Things like ensuring the reliability or removal of the hundreds of dams throughout Vermont, as well as replacing undersized culverts and bridges with wider, sometimes referred to as bankful width, structures that in turn can limit damage during flood events. One need not look any further than Vermont Route 100 and 107 in the Bethel, Killington, Stockbridge area. Following Irene, these roadways needed to be fully reconstructed, and as part of that work, damaged or destroyed bridges were replaced by new structures with increased waterway openings. In addition, hundreds of tons of large diameter rock was used to reinforce particularly vulnerable sections of the roadway. And although 100 and 107 required temporary closures during the July and early August flooding, the roads reopened quickly and required relatively modest repairs. And finally, fast and effective response is essential to supporting the safety and well-being of Vermonters in the face of climate change. Some of the best examples here can feel relatively mundane, but are important. Things like established collaborative relationships between A&R river engineers, town road foremen, and the Agency of Transportation, and developing emergency permitting guidelines and the ability to waive 30-day public comment periods during a declared state of emergency. Ultimately, as the governor noted in his remarks, we know we need to continue to work to curb our greenhouse gas emissions and invest in the programs and projects that will make Vermont more resilient. The team at A&R, including our Climate Action Office, helps improve resiliency through science-based monitoring and analysis, information sharing, public outreach and technical assistance, and providing grants and cost-share opportunities to support the implementation of sustainable, effective projects. What I hope you will come away from is a clear sense that we have a good understanding of the work that needs to be done to continue to improve and enhance resilience that was only reinforced by dividends paid this summer from the improved coordination, education, planning, and implementation that Vermonters have engaged in since Irene. And with that, I'll turn it over to General Roy.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. I'm always amazed at the governor's staff. On different calls we have, I hear Secretary Moore talk about everything from wastewater treatment plants to bridges and the like. So she and Secretary of Transportation and the whole team, it's just such a pleasure to work with. And as a Vermonter, it truly is a blessing, sir. So thank you for the opportunity to work with your team. A couple quick comments to make today. As we were approaching October 12th for the closure of the incident for the individual assistance program for registration, we recognized that we were getting a number of eligible applicants day after day after day. And so the state did an analysis, and based upon their analysis and the work with our individual assistance team, we recognize that there's probably room for additional opportunities for people to apply for assistance. So at the state's request, FEMA has approved the expansion of the individual assistance registration period to the end of the month, the 31st of October. So it's a great opportunity for us to continue to assist those who have been impacted by this disaster. I appreciate all the work that you have done and putting the word out on how to apply for FEMA assistance. We're working with the state on which the disaster recovery centers will keep open, and so there'll be more information on that to come. We do know that for the Barry Auditorium, because of already planned areas, we're going to have to close that one. That is our busiest one, but the governor and his team are helping us find another location that will be as accessible as the Barry Auditorium had been, so there'll be a slight delay. We are keeping Waterbury open to the end of the week, at least, to be able to serve as a buffer for that. And then we're taking a look at Ludlow to see how long that will continue to stay open as well. And as a reminder, the disaster recovery centers are not just a place for people to go to register. They're really for a place to go when they have questions about letters they get on their eligibility, so that the staff there can help them work through and negotiate, what can be, sometimes unfortunately a confusing process. In addition to that, we continue to work with the state on the public assistance program. We are now at 199 applicants between small towns, as large cities, as well as private nonprofits. And we've already developed 649 projects for an estimated cost of $143 million. That does not include, in the totality of it, the Agency of Transportation, nor Buildings Grounds. So I suspect that will most likely end up over $200 million, similar to Irene. And we're working very, very closely with the state on hazard mitigation programs. There's two programs that we work in FEMA for hazard mitigation. One is under Section 406 of the Stafford Act, and that's associated with public assistance. And so it makes a damaged facility more resilient. And then 404 mitigation is looking at the totality of what could be utilized, the money that's set aside from this disaster. Typically 15% of the money for a disaster is set aside for the Section 404 mitigation, and those can be used for such things as buyouts, as the Secretary spoke about, as well as other projects to make the state more resilient. And so, again, we appreciate your consistency in putting out the word on ability to register for assistance from FEMA for individuals. And at the end of the month, we'll give you a closeout as to where we are. We have, by the way, provided over $21.4 million for individual assistance so far. And that does not include the direct housing mission, which we continue to work on. So thank you very much for the opportunity to pass that on to you today, and I'll pass it back to the governor. Sir.
Thank you very much, General Roy. We'll now open it up to questions.
Governor, you mentioned resiliency. We have a strategic plan for emission reductions, the Global Warming Solutions Act. do we have anything, or do you envision any plan for resiliency? Like
Well,
with
yeah,
benchmarks?
absolutely. We're pushing forward with resiliency in light of the storm. For instance, I talk about thinking big. We're looking at, and I've talked about this in press briefings previously, but in Barrie, for instance, there's a section that we need to build some resiliency into that area. We need to, along our whole corridor, in terms of the watershed corridor from Barrie to Montpelier to Waterbury. So thinking about building out the capacity water storage area where we have a reserve where we can store the water to prevent further damage downstream is going to be important. So we'll be going forward with that. We're working with our congressional delegation on that to secure funding because it's not a small dollar issue. It's a big price tag. So.
Do you see like a plan though of like, by this date, we need to have this many bridges that were built after such and such a date, culverts replaced, we need to have these areas, these flood prone areas bought out or restored? I mean, do you see like a piece of legislation or any tangible plan, if you will, that Vermonters can see?
Well, again, we will be doing, this is going to be a very major part of this recovery. There's going to be other areas within this event itself that will come to light. So we'll have to see what we are able to accomplish with some FEMA help or with some supplemental funding. It all comes down to dollars. So we know where we want to focus on at this point in time, and we'll just have to wait and see whether we have the funding to go along with that. That'll determine our next steps. Anything you want to add to that?
If I might. I think it's important also to know there's a state hazard mitigation plan that's developed by Vermont Emergency Management and updated, I believe, once every 4 or 5 years. They are currently in the throes of finalizing the most current update. It was actually supposed to happen over the summer and was delayed by their attention to the flood events. And that sort of works in conjunction with the programs the governor is speaking to. There are real opportunities following a declared disaster to sort of move us a giant step forward in terms of resilience. But that state hazard mitigation plan is kind of lays the groundwork for the foundational day in, day out work we're doing as state government to improve resilience day over day, week over week.
Adding to Calvin's question, do you see, in terms of creating a long-term flood resiliency plan like this, or climate resiliency plan, like a legally binding mechanism like the Global Warming Solutions Act, where Vermonters can sue the state if it doesn't meet these benchmarks?
Well, again, I'll let Secretary Moore talk about this, but part of what we've been trying to do, I think our members of the Climate Council have been trying to do, is build resiliency in there, and there's been some pushback in that regard. Yeah, I mean it's part of the same thing. So we haven't been successful in doing that, but I think it should be part of the plan. As I stated in the beginning, we can't just focus on emissions. We have to focus on resiliency and face reality. And I don't know if we're doing that right now. Good more.
So the Global Warming Solutions Act does include some language around resilience. In particular, it tasks A&R with developing what's called a Municipal Vulnerability Index. So it's a tool that will be available by the end of this year that would allow communities to conduct a municipality-specific assessment of where key climate vulnerabilities are. I think the challenge in part has been we have these very explicit greenhouse gas concentration targets that we're required to achieve under the Global Warming Solutions Act. It's not possible to make those kind of quantitative targets when it comes to resilience, because it isn't an all or nothing proposition, right? Like, there is no risk fully eliminated. It's managing our risk. So it doesn't have that same quantified set of metrics, and I think as a result doesn't receive necessarily the attention it should in the conversations about our climate work. It's been hard to get it on par with greenhouse gases or even with clean water, where we have clear numeric targets that we're aiming for.
Secretary Moore, while you're up there, also the Chief Recovery Officer Farnham. I know you guys were both at Barry City Council last night. So I guess just first off, and with the mayor talking about they have a $13 million budget and they have quadruple, even more than that, in damages. So I guess maybe after being there and hearing from people, what were some of your key takeaways? And then also, you talk about resilience and building back. What kind of ideas we maybe have for that Barry area specifically, if you have any?
Sure, I'll start and then gladly turn it over to Doug to talk further. I think it's clear that it's going to take a combination of local, state, and federal resources to build back in a resilient fashion, that it is not reasonable to think that the community could do that kind of recovery work on their own, nor even that the state has the resources necessary to help envision what that future could look like for Barry. I think there are components of all of the elements I talked about today, looking for opportunities to create some nature-based solutions and let the Stevens branch be able to flow out of its banks without having such catastrophic results. Thinking about floodproofing and hardening of infrastructure that is likely to remain in the floodplain, so that we could have that faster recovery on the back end. And then looking at some of our infrastructure designs components. We know that there's some constrictions in the Stevens branch that sort of exacerbated the flood conditions, and looking at where bridges and culverts and dams, as well as downstream infrastructure that may have backed water up, could be modified in order to address future flood events.
Thanks, Julie. Doug Farnham, Chief Recovery Officer. I would start off by saying one reason we were in Barry last night is that if you look at the debris pulled out of Barry, the individual assistance awards, the number of heating systems that are still out of not working properly, Barry suffered roughly 2.5 times the damage of the nearest community, which Montpelier also had very significant damage, right? But Barry's metrics are all add up to be about 2.5 times. So that community was hit exceptionally hard, and that's one reason it was important for us to be there last night. I think aside from the specific resiliency and river elements, we need to balance that approach with housing investments, infill investments that are outside of the floodplain, mitigate what we can if it has to be inside the floodplain, right? Many of our villages and towns, we're not going to be able to move that far away from the river, right? We're restricted on the reality of where we developed, and we have to make the best of the footprint that we have. So I think it's going to be important that we support Barry. I mean, there is prior to the flood, there was a significant housing shortage in Barry. There was a homelessness issue, and this has only exacerbated that and made it more important that we tackle it. So I think approaching the community with a holistic approach that balances their housing needs with the resiliency needs and the environmental needs. And the community seemed very interested in that last night. So I do think there's a lot of energy, and as the governor said, we're going to need federal funds to make it happen. It's a big project, it's a big concept, and it's not something we would be able to fund on our own.
I guess speaking of the adaptation, resiliency, Secretary Moore mentioned that part of that, like hardening buildings, is like Waterbury bringing our utilities above the floodplain. Do we have any sort of update of what that looks like, or how that work is, or that planning is going at the state office, or in the Capitol complex and Department of Taxes?
Yeah, we're moving forward. This is going to take some time to do everything that needs to be done, but in the Capitol complex, the buildings are coming back online. I think you saw that the History Center opened back up in 109. So things are moving forward, but it still has a way to go in terms of insulation and making sure everything is safe to go in the rest of the building. So it's going to be months before that's ready to be occupied.
Any idea of the price tag on bringing these?
It's a big price tag. Again, I don't know if we've come to full conclusion on the amount, but it's significant. Especially when you add all of them together, 109, 133, and all the other buildings that were impacted.
On the note of Barry needing a lot of help, I mean, as Barry rebuilds, is there anything that you guys can do to make sure that it's not gentrified and that people aren't displaced? as there's a big influx, hopefully, of money into the area?
Yeah, no, that will obviously have to be part of the plan forward, and that's something that we'll work hand in hand with the city on, because we want to make sure that we're protecting people. We're not trying to displace people. We're trying to help them get into the future. So, in my mind, it's a phased project, and making sure that we have a plan in place that where we can move people to as we contemplate the hardening, the mitigation, and so forth. And as well, I think it's important to note, and I've said this before, but anything we can do upstream in terms of storage capacity, water storage in particular, will help those downstream. So when we're thinking about Barry, big project there, we are also faced with the central garage and what happened on the backside of the river there with the mobile home park, and trying to determine whether we rebuild there or not. And then we increase storage capacity to help Montpelier. So it's all connected in some way.
How long do you think you'll be up here?
I believe we'll be here for another 2-3 months.
And then back to Pavilion?
Yes.
Okay. Governor, speaking of resilience, Green Mountain Power has filed a plan, with state regulators to make blackouts a thing of the past by 2030. Have you seen that, and what do you think of it?
I haven't seen it, but I've heard the reports. I haven't spoken to them directly about this, but building resiliency is important to all of us in different ways, and it goes to the grid as well. I think the headlines misconstrued a bit of what I was thinking when I saw the headlines, like we're going to bury all the lines by 2030, which at first I thought was just not possible. So when I read further in, they're talking about building overhead line resiliency, keeping some, maybe burying some, providing for battery storage in individual homes and so forth. I think that all makes sense. But what's the price tag? Who's going to pay for it? Are all questions that need to be flushed out, and that's what the PUC will be doing.
I don't know if this is a question for Will or for the governor, but with the FEMA IA registration deadline having extended to October 31st, what's the status of the Small Business Administration loan deadline?
I don't know.
Thank you for bringing up our number one partner. They will continue on just as we have, and also, while we couldn't do individual assistance in Addison because they didn't meet the indicators, SBA was able to go there because the state requested them to go there, and there's several homes that were able to receive assistance from the SBA, helping them through a very difficult period. And speaking of the SBA, so they have actually executed 476 loans to both homeowners, renters, and businesses, and they're currently at $22.9 million of assistance they've provided as well. And so again, they'll be alongside us through the 31st of October.
And is that, this is so annoyingly petty, is that 11:59 p.m. on October 31st? Or?
Yeah, I would say, Sam, yep, through midnight, yep.
Okay.
Great point, thank you.
None of your questions here are annoying or petty. I just want to go on record as saying.
Governor, last night the Burlington City Council passed a resolution aimed at tackling the public safety and drug crisis. As part of that resolution, they called on lawmakers and you to walk the streets of Burlington and to visit Burlington. Is that something that you would do?
Well, I do visit Burlington. It's part of Vermont, and an integral part of Vermont. And we're all in this together. Pointing fingers at each other isn't going to solve the problem. We're going to have to tackle this together. We have a plan forward that has been exacerbated by many, many different things. The flooding, for one, pandemic, another. I think fentanyl and xylazine have complicated things because that's a border issue. So we have to get help from the federal government to secure borders, cut off the supply, so to speak. That'll be helpful. But again, the principles of how we're choosing to attack this problem remain the same. And it really is about prevention, treatment, recovery, and enforcement. And we have to have all four legs of the stool in order to accomplish that. So we're a willing partner, obviously, for the entire state. And we'll look forward to working with them.
Are you concerned with what some people perceive as a decline in the state's, one of the state's biggest tourist attractions? I mean, Burlington is a big economic driver. Some people are concerned, businesses leaving, public safety concerns. Is that something that's on your radar?
Yes, absolutely, and something that we identified it early. We had troopers available to the city early on, as you remember. There's been a couple of task forces put together to help in terms of the supply of illegal drugs into the community. So again, we're in this together, and I'm concerned, but this is a countrywide problem. It's not just Burlington, it's not just Vermont, it's across the country.
I guess the last question, you mentioned, the leading into prevention and treatment. What's your assessment of how the state's harm reduction efforts have been going with Narcan, test strips, needle exchanges, etc.? I mean, where does that fit into the equation?
Yeah, it's all part of the solution. There's no one easy answer to this. It's from all different types of approaches, and I was just at event yesterday with Jenna's Promise and Jenna's House, and we talked about harm reduction, Narcan, and treatment solutions that they've incorporated that have been successful. And so again, there's no one answer to this, and we need to work at this together.
Back to flooding, my colleague Audie asked me to ask, is there any kind of recourse or state law that renters can point to if they were displaced by the flood or had utility cutoffs or faced flood issues, and now their landlords are demanding back rent and threatening evictions?
I don't have the answer to that, but we can get the answers to that. I mean,
Seems like Doug has something.
I can address
Doug?
it, Governor.
Oh, great.
So Vermont does not currently have a requirement in leases for an out clause for natural disasters. So that's something that is used in other states, and I think we're assessing that. It is complicated, and we want to look at why, if this was discussed in the past, why it wasn't added as a required element of leases. But it's definitely not an element of Vermont law currently.
Okay, so there's really nothing that renters can do then?
Well, I think a lot of it comes down to being fact-based, and if they're low income, I would say that a great option for them is to consult with legal aid and see, because if I'm far from an expert on this, but if the unit didn't have utilities and wasn't habitable, then legal aid may be able to help them with recourse. But there's no automatic clause in Vermont leases that says if there was a disaster, you automatically don't have to pay rent. It's gets more into the weeds than that.
Okay. Governor, would you support a law? I know I'm putting you on the spot here, but adding that in as a requirement for leases?
Well, we have to take a look at it and see what the language does and the repercussions as a result, but always willing to consider anything that protects the general public.
Okay, we've got one on the phone. We'll go to Keith, Raleigh Herald.
Hi, so this talk of
resiliency with regard to flooding has me thinking this. We're putting a lot of eggs in the flood basket, which makes complete sense given what we've been dealing with. But I wondered, just given what's been going on in Canada with wildfires, we're obviously of a similar sort of geography. I'm just wondering if we have any plan or a thought as to the state of possible wildfires in Vermont going into the future here.
Well, we're always on guard in some respects and watching that. We've done that for probably decades. It started with our fire towers, as a matter of fact. So this isn't unique, but it has become more of an issue as we've seen the wildfires across Canada and in the U.S. as well. Secretary Moore?
Sure. Vermont has received funding under the bipartisan infrastructure law that's gone into the Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation to specifically update our forest action plan and some of our contingencies around wildland fires. And we'll be bringing on an additional staff, limited service staff person actually to assist in that work. You're right, Keith, in flagging that resilience goes well beyond just flooding. Wildfires are certainly a concern. Wildfires here tend to look different than I think they do in northern Canada. We tend to have smoldering fires that stay underground, but that makes them no less concerning, and there is need for strategies to address them as we continue to contemplate what our climate future will look like.
Thank you.
Back to the room.
Will, do you have an end date for the Ludlow Recovery Center, when that might be closing?
We don't at this point in time. We, having just approved yesterday the extension, we need to get an assessment from the state as to how long they would like us to have us here. I do understand that there are challenges with the location we're at because it's going to be turned into a haunted house. And so not quite the scenario we want to have set up. So if we're going to stay in Ludlow, we'll probably have to find another location.
Okay. And when you say, so I know you got to move out of the Barrie Auditorium because of the hockey games, but would it be another location in Barrie, do you think?
Yeah, our intent is it being Barrie because that is our largest producing DRC.
Cool. Okay.
Thank you.
So where do we stand with the FEMA trailers in Montpelier, timeline for those? And then also, there were some in the Upper Valley, if I'm not mistaken, right?
So we're working with residents who are both in Windsor and Lamoille counties to find locations for them. And if not, we've got two other avenues, the direct lease and the multifamily lease and repair programs. For the Montpelier site, we had a design in place. We worked with the city on it. There were some slight modifications they wanted us to make to the footprint we had. So we've redrawn it. We provided it to them yesterday, and we're meeting with them on Friday to hopefully go final on that, taking a look at the infrastructure, et cetera, to see where we're at. So we recognize that weather is getting colder. And time is running out, so we're very hopeful that by the end of this week we'll be in a good place to start moving forward.
And when do you expect people to move in?
We're still hoping, for before the end of the year, December timeframe. Once they start, they move pretty quickly.
And are there still, 7 trailers that are stationed?
Yes.
Here?
Yep.
And then you
I
can
think
get more
there's
later?
one here, and I think there's 6 down at the staging area. Yep.
Okay.
So obviously we can move very quickly for the first ones.
Yeah.
And it only takes 2 days to get those units up from the staging area that they're at down south.
Where?
It's a couple different places they have them at. There's one, I think, in Frederick, and then also we have a large location in Alabama as well. So, but once they get them on the roads, it's a pretty quick turn.
Okay.
And they're all, as I mentioned before, they're all built for northern climates, so no challenges there. Thanks.
Do we also have an update as to how many people still don't have heat or haven't been contacted? Where we stand with?
I don't believe it's changed a whole lot from last week, but we're trying to pull that information together as we're still getting calls, thanks to all of you, and we're getting calls to the governor's office, so we're putting them into the system.
It was about 250 or 200?
It's probably closer to the 250 mark.
What's the status of the federal building in Montpelier?
I don't know. Good question. I don't have the answer to that. I'm not sure that FEMA does either. They're on their own, so to speak.
Oh, okay.
Um,
So do you know what the situation is with the postal service?
Same. I think it's aligned with the federal building. So I just don't have the answer to that.
Okay.
I think they have a general services operation within the state government that they're the ones holding the cards at this point.
Governor, one of the judges you appointed, Justin Jarman, over in Caledonia County, has been getting a lot of flack from law enforcement over there for releasing felons, including drug traffickers, with little or no bail. Does this give you any pause to your future judicial appointments, to be asking them in particular, what's your plan for that?
Yeah. Well, we have been asking all of those I've interviewed what their plan is in that regard. So that'll be ongoing.
Did you make a mistake with him in that regard, do you think?
I don't believe so. I think that I have to have faith in his judgment and what he's doing. And I don't know anything about the specific cases, but I think he made it to the next level to become a judge because I had faith in his integrity and his ability to make those decisions. So I will have to acquiesce to him on that.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you all very much.